Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Roper, who was formerly employed by Celotex. But before we hear from Mr. Roper, I'd just like to welcome Mr. Akbor, who's joined us today in person. We're very pleased to see him here and to have him with us. So, would you ask Mr. Roper to come back in, please? Okay. Good morning, Mr. Roper. Good morning. All right, all ready to go?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and good morning to the entire panel. Mr. Roper, good morning.
Good morning.
I'd now like to turn, please, to some questions about SOTEC and IFC. It's right, isn't it, that in June 2013, you made contact with SOTEC, didn't you?
Correct, yes.
Yes. And can we please have CEL 50602, page 3, up on the screen? And you can see here that there's a reference at the foot of the page to the meeting that took place between you and Michael Egginton of SOTEC earlier that month, isn't there?
Yes.
Do you remember the meeting?
I do, yes.
Was it arranged, or did you meet them at an event?
I met Michael at a REBA event where I was presenting on building information modelling.
Right. If we look at the top of page 4 and look at the paragraph at the top of the page in that email, you say to him, I tried putting a call through to you earlier, but you were away from your desk, so I thought I'd follow up with an email regarding possible partnering opportunities for testing to BR135. As we spoke about last Wednesday, we are looking to be compliant in rain screen systems for buildings above 18 metres in height, and to do so we will need to carry out 2 large-scale fire tests in accordance with BS 8414. Now, is it right that originally you were considering testing to both parts 1 and 2? Yes?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
But in the end, that was subsequently abandoned in favour of a part 2 test only, I think, wasn't it?
Correct.
Now, we know that a meeting did take place with SOTEC on the 20th of June 2013. Do you remember that meeting?
Was that the meeting at their offices?
It is. Can we look at CEL 401863, please? This is a note of that meeting, and if we look at the first page, we can see that it's called a BR135 meeting in Durham, and present listed were you, and then 3 individuals from SOTEC, John Egginton, Michael Egginton, who I think is John Egginton's son, is that right? Yes, and Graham Todd, who's the SOTEC Sales Manager UK. You see that? Can I just ask first, is that a note that you made of that meeting?
I believe it is, yes.
Presumably, as you were the only person present.
Yes.
And in the note, you can see that the purpose is to discuss partnering opportunities for testing to BR135, to understand previous experience and methods for testing to BS 8414 using both rock wool and phenolic insulation behind a SOTEC cladding system. And then about halfway down the first page, do you see it says, under SOTEC and BS 8414 1/2, it says, successfully passed to both 84141 and 84142. Both systems incorporated rock wool insulation and AIM fire barriers. And then it goes on to say, 15 minutes testing, BRE extinguished the chamber due to fire being at the 9-metre level using K15. SOTEC reverted to rock wool and passed aluminium railing system and cladding panels found to melt and allow fire to enter cavity. Outer face resistance to fire and tolerance of fire barriers proven to be crucial. And then, well, can I just ask you before we go on with that, outer face resistant to fire and tolerance of fire barriers proven to be crucial. Was the outer face there a reference to the rain screen material, the cladding?
It was, yes.
It was. So you were told, were you, that the success of an 8414 test may depend on the cladding material used?
Correct.
And specifically in relation to cladding materials, you say in the last 2 lines there, the aluminium railing system and cladding panels found to melt and allow fire into cavity. Just pausing there, you knew that aluminium, therefore, is this right, was a particularly risky cladding material to use with K15 as the insulation, as opposed to rock wool?
Yeah, Celotex explained that. I'm just trying to think back to whether the aluminium refers to the panel or the railing system itself.
Well, it says aluminium railing system and cladding panels.
Yes. Yeah, so there were conversations that took place that suggested that the outer face of the cladding was crucial, but equally the aluminium rails that hold the cladding panel was equally crucial.
Yes. And is it right, therefore, that you knew that aluminium as the material of choice for the cladding panels, just focusing on that, was a particularly risky choice of material to use with K15 as the insulation, as opposed to rock wool?
Well, that was Celotex's view, yes.
That was Celotex's view, and you recorded that.
Yes.
And then if you look under the next section, K15 BBA certification and literature, you record, astonished as to how K15 is used so widely, based on testing involving a cement particle board as the outer face to represent a typical cladding panel. You see that? And just on that, astonishment is what you record. Whose astonishment was it that you were recording there?
Both parties, I believe.
Right.
I think it's probably the first time that I had indicated to Celotex the details of K15's BBA certificate. So yeah, astonishment from both parties.
Right. I see. In your witness statement, if we can go back to that, please, at page 7, you say at paragraph 4.1.3, we just look at that, please. And this is in relation to this meeting. You describe the test there as unrepresentative. You say you discussed how Kingspan appeared to be selling its product for use in a variety of systems based on an unrepresentative test conducted some years ago. Was that actually said in the meeting, do you recall?
Yes, it was.
Yes. And why was it unrepresentative?
Because I think that we jointly looked into their certification, and as I go on to explain there, I think what we assumed or found was that there were cement particle boards, which is a building board and not a decorative rain screen that was used.
Yeah, so cement particle board not being widely used in the market made it an unrepresentative test.
Correct.
In your view? Yes?
Yes.
And in Celotex's view too?
Correct.
Right. Now, you also note the panel, the fire barriers that were used there, Promo Seal. And was that because you understood that they had also contributed to the pass? I think we need to go back, I think, to the note of the meeting. We were on one document back, if we can. It's 3 lines down in the paragraph that we were looking at. You say you identified Kingspan used Promoseal fire barriers fixed to a galvanised, you see that, a galvanised steel sheet. Celotex convinced that the system quoted using a standard cladding panel would fail as the post flashover that occurs would penetrate and melt the panel and allow flame to enter the cavity. In essence, is it right, really, Celotex were telling you that Kingspan had only passed as a result of an unrepresentative test, and that if Kingspan K15 was used in a representative build-up, in other words, a commonly used rig, using a metal panel, it would fail?
That's what their view was, yes.
Yes. And then I think in the next section below that, you go on to identify potential systems using Celotex, and there are 4 options there set out. Were those options those that you put forward or those that Celotex put forward? Do you remember?
No, they were ones that we discussed at the meeting, and mainly I was leaning on them as the manufacturer to come up with options. Right.
Given the risk that Celotex had identified, why did you think it was acceptable to go on to try to achieve BR135 classification in circumstances where systems using metal panels, such as aluminium, might well fail?
Because that was their experience with a particular product. I mean, the properties of phenolic and PIR are different. At that time, I don't think anybody at Celotex had carried out a large-scale fire test, and there wasn't any clarity as to how that product performed in relation to how phenolic performs in that situation. Hence, it wasn't disregarded altogether at that stage.
I follow. Now, going back a paragraph in the note, it goes on to say 4 lines up from the end of the previous section, K15 BBA certification and literature. It says, cleverly designed and worded, i.e. non-combustible substrate wording used in literature, could be interpreted as applicable for Part 1 and Part 2, CP board and masonry face. Outer face using CP board classified as 6mm non-combustible cladding in product literature. Was that by reference to the Kingspan BBA certificate?
Yes, it was, yes.
It was. Did you think that that was acceptable at the time?
I thought it was cleverly worded.
What do you mean by cleverly worded?
I thought that at the time there was no clarity as to who the manufacturer of that cladding was that they tested with, or what the material actually was.
When you say clever, do you mean potentially misleading but strictly accurate?
Yes.
Yes. Now, can we go to CEL 401865, please? This is an email from you, looking at the second one, to Paul Evans, and he responds to that. But looking at the second message down, it's not particularly clear that it's an email from you, but it says, 24th of June, 1359, Roper Jonathan wrote, find attached contact report following meeting at SOTEC last Thursday. So you're sending the note we've just been looking at to Paul Evans, are you,
yes,
on that date? Good. And then he responds to you the same day. Fantastic note. Let's keep the pace on this. As discussed, I'm far more comfortable having a recognised cladding panel and making the system work inside in line with guidance provided by a fire expert than just copying the cement particle route. You see that? So, had you discussed testing only using a cement particle board, just like Kingspan had done?
Yes, I think it was considered at the time.
Right. Had you had a discussion with Mr. Evans between the SOTEC meeting that we saw and you sending him your note of the meeting about using cement particle board in a BS 8414 test?
Yeah, I think the initial discussions that took place with Paul when I was tasked with looking into above 18 metres, the obvious place to look was at the direct competition and how they'd tested. There was always the view that they would like to test a more realistic system if possible, and not create a me too, so to speak. But that was an option to revert back to what Kingspan had tested.
And we'll come to that choice or option later on when we look at some of the later material. Sticking with this point in the year, June 2013, where we see that Mr. Evans says that he's far more comfortable having a recognised cladding panel and making the system work inside in line with guidance provided by a fire expert than just copying the cement particle route. Did you agree with that view at the time?
I did, yes. And I think the shared view amongst those individuals within Celotex that were looking at the development was that would create a competitive advantage.
And I think in the next month you engaged the services of, or tried to engage the services of IFC, didn't you?
Yes.
And you were seeking advice from them as to whether FRR 5000, as it then was, would pass a BS 8414 test, weren't you?
Correct.
Yes. Now let's just dive straight into the email on this. This is CEL 50673. And if we look at the email halfway down the page, this is from Dr. Parina Patel, 1559 on the 4th of September to you and Peter Jackman. And Peter Jackman was one of her colleagues.
That's right.
I think he's now deceased, isn't he? Sadly.
I believe so.
And if you look at the third paragraph in that email, just before the foot of the page, she says, and in fact I think it's actually an email that comes from him, Perina and I have now had a chance to review the BS 476 Part 6 and 7 test evidence for your FR 5000 material, which is far superior to the 4000 product information you forwarded earlier. The 5000 material is definitely superior to the material I reviewed a few weeks ago, not only in respect of its performance, but also in its variability, which is very low. We note that the specimens were tested under the nomenclature line 1 and line 2. Are we to assume that these designations represent the two manufacturing lines that the product can be made on? If so, they show excellent comparability. If you go over the page, he says in the first paragraph he's looking at the class naught indices, and then in the second paragraph says this is not directly confirmed by the BS 476 Part 7 tests, where the maximum flame spread was reached early, i.e. in the first 1.5 minutes, but I think it indicates that any heat released after the first 90 seconds did not manifest itself as flaming. This must be a good characteristic in respect of generating a satisfactory BS 8414 test. And then in the next paragraph he says, after performing this analysis, I believe we can understand your confidence in respect of achieving a good result under the 8414 method. We are of the opinion that the rates of flame spread and heat release indicated by the Part 6 and 7 results indeed form the basis for optimism. What was the basis, I'm showing you quite a lot of that, but what was the basis, did you think at the time, for thinking that the results of the BS 476 Part 6 and 7 tests could be relied upon or extrapolated to give a view about the potential success of a BS 8414 system test?
I didn't at the time. It was the only, to my knowledge, fire tests that Celotex had carried out, so I went to Paul and asked for the BS 476 details and sent those across. Primarily, I believe they were, as Peter and Perina have mentioned here, they were looking at how the FR 5000 compared to not only the phenolic foam, but equally the 4000 range of products that Celotex produced as well.
But did it not occur to you that the fact that the 5000 had done well with the class naught tests didn't indicate one way or the other whether it would pass a full system test under BS 8414 to BR 135 criteria?
No, I think, as I said, the only fire tests that were available at the time were the BS 476 tests. Yeah. They said that they would review that information, hence why I sent that across.
And in the last paragraph, last sentence of that email, you can see that Mr. Jackman says, as a result, if you go forward and book a test, we can assist in generating a specimen design to maximise the field of application in the knowledge that we will be the first to know of any possible changes that could affect the design. Is it in fact the case that IFC assisted with the design?
They carried out this initial research, and I believe they attended the first test. And they started looking into fire barriers from memory as well. So they did have some input into this.
If we scroll up to the very top of page 1, we can see that you forwarded this email string on to Paul Evans on the 10th of September, and in the second paragraph you say in the second sentence, I'll get the ball rolling again with the BRE for a test date end of October, early November, and endorse IFC to start designing the specimen alongside SOTEC. Did Celotex want IFC to be involved in order to maximise the possibility of a pass?
Yes.
Yes. And did IFC, in fact, ultimately take a role in the design of the test?
In the first test, yes.
In the first of February 2014, as it then turned out to be?
Yes.
They did. Yes, and we'll come to see how that evolves. Now, there's then a later meeting, later in the year, in October 2013, with both SOTEC and IFC, I think. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
And I'll show you a note of that in a moment. Do you remember that there was whether there was a meeting in July 2013?
No, I don't.
Let's show you CEL 50632. See if we can clear this up. This is an email. This predates the messages we've seen. This is an email from you to Parina Patel, top of the page, on the 15th of July 2013. Parina, as per our telephone conversation, this is confirmation of our acceptance for Peter to attend a half-day meeting commencing at 9:30 a.m. on Monday, the 22nd of July. Do you know whether that meeting took place? Do you remember it?
I believe it did, yes.
Do you remember what happened at that meeting or what was said at that meeting?
No, I don't.
Right. At any rate, we know there was a meeting on the 3rd of October 2013. Can we go to CEL 401195, please? And you refer to this meeting, in fact, at paragraph 5.2 of your witness statement. You now say you don't remember it. You remembered it when you did your statement, but you don't now. Is that the position?
I can remember these notes here, yes.
Right. Let's look at the note. Now, this, I think, was circulated by Jamie Hayes, and he, as you can see, was one of the attendees. Do you know who wrote this note?
Either myself or Jamie, I would imagine.
Right. We can see who was present. And the title of the meeting, or the note, is Above 18 Metres Fire Test, IFC and SOTEC Meeting, Peter Lee, 3rd of October 2013, summary. And we can see that those present were John Eggington of SOTEC, David Cooper of IFC, you, and Jamie Hayes from Celotex each. Do you think you wrote this note?
I can't say for sure, but it looks like something that I would have produced, yeah.
Right. And under fire test, it says, very problematic to pass. Kingspan failed twice with standard cavity barriers. And in the second bullet point down, it says, John at SOTEC, that's John Eggington, sceptical about pass with decorative cladding. Decorative cladding, what was that? What did that indicate?
I mean, that was a generic term. John was sceptical about rigid board, i.e. Kingspan or Celotex, passing an 8414 test with any form of decorative cladding.
Yes, what did he mean by decorative cladding?
I think that was the generic term in terms of metal, high-pressure laminate, fibre cement, all decorative cladding, I believe.
I follow. In contradistinction to cement particle board or fibre board?
Yes.
I see. Now, you'd previously discussed the fact that Kingspan had used a cement particle board to achieve a pass at your meeting in June with SOTEC. We saw that earlier. Was that discussed again at this meeting? It looks like it was, but
I believe
remember?
so, yeah.
And if you look down at the third bullet point, still no idea how Kingspan support the use of decorative cladding as their fire test uses a non-combustible cladding. Who said that? Do you remember?
I think that was a general view between most likely myself, Jamie, and John Eggington.
I see. Do you know how that general view arose? Who first made the point that they had no idea how Kingspan could support the use of decorative cladding given that their fire test had used non-combustible cladding, in other words, cement particle board?
I don't know who initially raised that, no.
Right. And then in the fifth bullet point down, possible idea to design double cavity fire barrier. And then in the next bullet point, it identifies it as a steel grille with an intumescent strip as well as a traditional mineral wool cavity barrier. Do you remember who mooted that, who suggested that as a setup?
Well, I think from speaking to John at SOTEC, the distinct differences between the tests that he'd carried out previously were predominantly the insulation, non-combustible and combustible, but from recollection I believe that he adjusted the cavity barrier for the test involving the non-combustible insulation. So that then led on to a discussion around cavity barriers and what were best suited to an 8414 test.
Right. Why the quotation marks around double cavity barrier?
I don't know, if I'm honest with you.
Is it because a double cavity barrier was similarly unrepresentative of what the market would use in a commonly used cladding system?
I think it related to the reference in Kingspan's BBA certificate to the PromoSeal fire barrier. It was not just a product reference, it was a PromoSeal fire barrier, and I can't remember the exact details, but it almost suggested that there was a double barrier used in that system.
Right. There's no reference here to PromoSeal, as there had been in your SOTEC note we saw earlier from the June meeting. You say possible idea to design double cavity barrier. It looks from that as if this would be something that would be thought up from scratch and designed as an innovation. Is
No,
that right?
I don't believe so, no. I think we would have referred back to Kingspan's BBA certificate. I think from memory, I looked into the PromoSeal fire barrier that was described and it was no longer available.
Was the potential for designing a double cavity barrier linked to the discussion of Kingspan having failed with a standard cavity barrier twice?
Yes, more than likely, yes.
Did SOTEC, or IFC for that matter, say that Kingspan had achieved their pass under BS 8414 using a double cavity barrier?
I think there was some confusion around the description that was contained in the BBA certificate, and I think all of the references suggested that there was that either used a fire barrier that was no longer available, or there was some form of doubling up of a fire barrier.
I see. And then looking at the previous bullet point, the fourth one down, very unlikely to pass on the basis that Celotex FR5000 is slightly better than phenolic according to IFC testing. Is the reference there to IFC testing a reference to the class 0 tests we saw in the earlier emails?
Yes, I believe so.
I see. And when it was said very unlikely to pass, was that IFC speaking, or was that John Egginton speaking, or was that any of either of you or Mr. Hayes?
I think that was Sotex speaking, yes, John.
That's John Egginton.
Yes.
Right. So do we take from that he was telling you that even if, as seemed to be the case, Celotex FR5000 was slightly better than phenolic, it still was very unlikely to pass?
In his opinion, yes.
In his opinion. Now, can we move on then in time? CEL 50714. This is an email from you to David Cooper of IFC, the 31st of October 2013. And you say, David, following our conversation yesterday evening, find attached the two A2 products that I've come across in the market, Alucobond A2 and Marley. Both are recognised names within the cladding industry, and I think knowing what we know now, this is the wiser option to pursue. As discussed, I think we should look to test one of the three following options, and then you list them. ACM panel with an improved fire barrier system, not overly confident that this is the right route to go down. A2 panel with a standard fire barrier from list below, and you can see the PromoSeal is in fact the fourth item on the list. Brackets, common build-up, which we could stand behind if challenged. 3, cement particle board as outer face per Kingspan last resort. And then in the last two sentences, 3 lines up from the end of the message, you say, my personal preference, which I will voice, is that if we have enough confidence in the A2 panel with standard barrier system, then we pursue this primarily. If this fails, a decision will need to be made whether we want to go down the Kingspan route or pull out altogether. Now, just to be clear, you are saying go with option 2. If that fails, we'll have to decide whether we go with option 3, which is cement particle board as outer face, last resort, or pull out altogether. So those are the 3 options. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Now, when you say knowing what we know now, as you do in the 3rd line of the email, what did you mean there? What had you learned?
Sorry, where?
3rd line of the email in the top paragraph, first paragraph. Do you see you say in the 2nd sentence in the 1st paragraph, both are recognised names within the cladding industry, and I think knowing what we know now, this is the wiser option to pursue.
I think it's probably reference the meeting at SOTEC and what was explored there.
I see. And in the first option, ACM panel with an improved fire barrier system Was that a reference to the double cavity barrier system that you discussed at that 3rd of October meeting?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. And it looks as if you weren't particularly confident about that route, hence you're saying so.
Yeah, from what John had said, yes.
Yes. And then if you look at the second option, you identify that, as we've seen, common build-up which we could stand behind if challenged. When you say stand behind if challenged, what would the challenge be based on that you were anticipating there?
Well, I think to put this email into context, the brief that I received was that they wanted to explore, Celotex wanted to explore 8414 testing, and ideally, given what they assumed or thought they knew about Kingspan's testing, they wanted a more representative system.
Right. Does that explain why you referred to the Kingspan approach in the third option there, cement particle board as outer face as per Kingspan, as a last resort?
Yes.
Because it wasn't representative of what was in the market?
That's what the perception was, yes.
Yes, I see. And why would you go down the Kingspan route at all if it was the last resort?
Because I guess there was still from my perspective, a general view within the business that they wanted to launch into this market regardless. And if that was the only way of passing the test, and given that I'd done some preliminary research relating to the fire properties of phenolic foam and PIR, if that was the only option, that's what they'd look to achieve.
Right. We'll come to see how these options then evolve further in a moment. Can I just take you back a week or two in time, earlier into October 2013, and go to CEL 403008, please. Now, this is an email. If you look at a third of the way down the page, you can see this is an email from you to Debbie Berger on the 18th of October, copy to Jamie Hayes. And you say, "Hi Debbie, if you're still happy to carry out the mystery caller scenario on Kingspan, could the three of us get together early afternoon today? See the brief below and a number of objectives that we would like to come out of the call with answers to. If we're both off the phones this afternoon, can I send an invite for, say, 2 p.m? And I'll just show you what the brief actually says. If you go to page 2 of this email run, just to refresh your recollection, this is the list of things to go through, which you'd also sent to Jamie Hayes earlier that day, and you were now sending to Debbie Berger. And the purpose was to gain further information on what recommendations, do you see, it says in the first line, what recommendations Kingspan are giving in regards to the use of K15 in buildings above 18 metres. First project of this scale, student accommodation / commercial, METSEC frame, cement particle board, envelope, NV1 bracket systems with Trespa Metion 2mm panels rivet fixed. Is Trespa Metion an ACM? No, a decorative cladding?
It's decorative cladding, yes. I believe it's a high pressure laminate.
Yeah, it's an HPL.
Yes.
Yeah. I see. And then you could set out what the objectives are there. Is K15 applicable with all cladding systems, etc.? So that was the background to this, and there are other questions as well there which are important. My question here, though, is did this mystery shopper exercise actually go ahead?
I believe it did, yes.
Do you know who called Kingspan?
I think it was Debbie.
I see. And did she report back to you what answers she'd got?
Yes, I believe she did, although I think the venture was quite unsuccessful, to be honest with you. I think what was relayed back to me was that they weren't very forthcoming with any of that information.
Right. Now, you then email Paul Evans on the 1st of November with a long email which I think summarised your research to date. Do you remember doing that?
I do, yes.
Yes, and we can look at that email, CEL 50716. And we'll just take this in stages, because it's a long document. It doesn't go to anybody else in Celotex. And you start by saying, well, I think we have two possible solutions for testing, in which both David at IFC and I have confidence in. We'll explain more on Monday, but essentially since the beginning of the project, we have been looking at testing worst-case scenario with an improved fire barrier to be then supported by an assessment report which broadens the scope of potential systems that we are applicable for. Now just pausing there, we've seen earlier, I think, that the BRE, well, let me put it to you this way. Do you remember that earlier, Stephen Howard of the BRE had told you that a field of application report, or an FOAR, was not something which applied to BS 8414 tests?
That's what we covered on Thursday, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, we did. And you then go on to say, after much research, I don't think this is possible, and I don't believe Kingspan have a similar report. We cannot seem to find or design a suitable barrier in which we have enough confidence that it can be used behind a standard ACM panel, which we know will melt and allow fire into the cavity. Speaking to Simco on Wednesday in Birmingham with IL, that's Ian Lathbury, I think, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. He confirmed that architects will specify K15 with a standard fire barrier and panel. When the work is contracted, then subcontracted to cladding contractors such as Simco, AJ Marks, Stanmore, etc. They value engineer that system to be competitive at tender. This means changing fire barriers, changing panels. The architect's only guarantee is that K15 will be used because there is no other alternative available. Now, when you say, is in the penultimate line there, changing panels, did you mean changing rain screen panels?
Correct.
Yes. And when you say, we know will melt and allow fire into the cavity, that I've just read you there in the third line, how had you come by that knowledge? Was that through the meetings with Sotec?
Correct, yes.
Would you say that that was common knowledge within Celotex?
Yes, I believe it. I believe it probably was. Yeah.
Right. What's the basis for that belief?
Because I fed back into the business what I'd researched and.
Right. Do you think it was common knowledge within the industry more generally?
That ACM would melt.
Yes.
I think probably ACM panels at the time were regarded as not as fire resistant as others.
Just on ACM, I take it you understood at the time that it stood for aluminium composite material.
I did, yes.
In other words, not just pure aluminium, but something else in there too.
I didn't at the time understand the differences between the cores. I'd heard Sotec talk about A2 and other such core materials, but I guess I probably didn't really take into account or fully understand the differences between the cores that were being produced for ACM panels. Was
there any discussion at all between you and Celotex, you and Sotec and you and IFC about the use of polyethylene cores within ACM panels?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Is it fair to say, just looking at what you're telling Paul Evans here, that RS5000 should not be used with ACM, even as you understood it?
I think, yeah, what I'm saying here is that we haven't got enough confidence in carrying out a BS 8414 test with an ACM panel based on what John at Sotec had told me.
That's a more accurate answer to my less accurate question. Now, you go on to say that there was no way of guaranteeing what cladding or fire barriers would be used, because whatever was specified would be subject to value engineering. Given that observation, were you not concerned that even if you knew that RS5000 should not be used with ACM, it might come to be in any event as a result of value engineering exercises?
I think that's what was happening generally, yes.
Yes. And I think, in fact, in the fourth paragraph, as we see, you go on to say, after the rhetorical question, what does all this mean for us? system approval limits us hugely, as the market is so fragmented and it's extremely difficult to grasp who is being most commonly used. The likes of Marley, Aluka, Bond, Trespa expect a lot, but value engineered out for standard aluminium panels. Trying to do the right thing requires a complete re-education of the market, and this would require a huge campaign and probably a lawsuit. 2 options proposed below. Now, just pausing on the identification of the brands there, you say they're value engineered out for standard aluminium panels. Again, standard aluminium panels, does that mean ACM?
I believe so, yes.
Now, in the previous paragraph, and I'm sorry to jump around this, but this is probably the logical way through it. If you go to the 3rd paragraph, you say here, an architect will be told that K15 is applicable for above 18 metres in accordance with ADB, and that suffices from their perspective. Kingspan have done a great job at the spec, and according to Simco, are specified much more than Rockwool Duo slab for thermal performance. As discussed above, contractors opt for more cost-effective solutions, and although they are liable for what goes into that building, they do not know enough about the fire test to challenge. The only figure who might possibly challenge a product's eligibility for use in buildings above 18 metres is the building control officer. Kingspan, I would suggest, do not have a piece of paper that states they can specifically be used behind any cladding panel. What they've done is got a BBA certification stating the fire test method and taken that to LABC to get a registered document detail which states that K15 can be used in a variety of cladding systems and complies with ADB through passing BR135. A building control officer is unlikely to challenge a document that is approved from the head of building control. Now, that paragraph is reasonably clear, but let's see if I can just put what I understand you're saying here back to you. Kingspan, is this right? We're making very broad claims about the suitability for use above 18 metres of their product, K15, underpinned by BBA and LABC certificates, which give the impression that it can be used in a variety of systems.
Yes, I think that's right, but I think I'll expand on that and the initial point about Kingspan doing a good job or a great job, as I refer to it, at the spec end. What was clear at this stage was that the primary consideration for insulation on the external wall of the building was the thermal performance, and I think very little consideration was given to the fire performance of those products.
And I think you go on to say building control were very unlikely to challenge those claims. Was that because there was an LABC certificate?
Yeah, I think from what I'd seen, Kingspan had got both a BBA certificate and an LABC certificate, and I guess I assumed that because they were being used in such a variety of cladding systems, building control were looking at those documents.
Did you understand that it was the LABC who were, as you put it, the head of building control, as the words you use at the end of that 3rd paragraph there?
Did I understand?
Yes, you say a building control officer is unlikely to challenge a document that is approved from the head of building control. Was head of building control LABC?
No, I don't believe so.
What was head of building control then that you meant there?
I believe I was probably referring to what is now known as the Building Control Alliance.
I see. The Building Control Alliance don't approve things, do they? It's the LABC, which is what you identified as what Kingspan had.
My understanding is that you have LABC and NHBC and some numerous other private building control inspectors, and they all feed into the Building Control Alliance, but I may have...
I see. The short point, though, is that once you got through the LABC gateway, then building control officers up and down the country would not challenge what it said and would proceed to permit Kingspan onto buildings.
That's what I assumed, yeah.
Yes. Now, is it fair to say that you were explaining here that there was a lack of understanding in the market about the regulatory requirements for insulation above 18 metres?
I think there was a lack of understanding, and there was consideration given to other areas when it came to the insulation and the cladding panel.
Yes. Is that a delicate way of saying that, in your view at the time, as you were expressing it to Paul Evans, you were exploiting Kingspan were exploiting the lack of understanding in the market in order to get round the regulatory requirements?
I think they were driving demand based on thermal performance.
And had managed to obtain a BBA certificate and an LABC registered document detail. Yes.
Yes.
Did you consider at the time that Kingspan had, put it bluntly, done something wrong in order to obtain the BBA certificate and the LABC document?
No, I think that the BBA certificate is a certificate for the product as a whole, not just specific to the product in application, and certainly not specific to the product in application above 18 metres. I think that what this was clear evidence was that they had two documents that they could use should they be challenged on whether they've passed a BR or a BS 8414 test.
And when you said earlier on that they were driving demand based on thermal performance, was the flip side of that was that they were doing so without inviting too much close attention on fire performance?
Yes.
Yes. Was it your view at the time that you were trying to communicate to Paul Evans that Kingspan had been perhaps economical with the truth?
Yes.
Yeah. And you then go on to say, and I've shown you this in the last sentence of the fourth paragraph, that trying to do the right thing requires a complete re-education of the market, and this would require a huge campaign and possibly a lawsuit. What did you mean there by doing the right thing?
Well, I think I explained on Thursday the sort of divisive issue of system versus product, and the debate that was happening within the business at the time. There were two schools of thought that one, a BS 8414 test was a system, and then I guess a more commercial view that a competitor was selling in a variety of cladding systems based on one approval. I guess what I'm trying to say here is it was my view that it was a system test, and to try and enforce that would suggest that what architects and contractors and subcontractors and building control had been doing for a number of years since 2006 was incorrect.
Yes. So by doing the right thing, you meant system, means
I meant
system.
Yeah, I meant advertise it as a system and only applicable to the components of that system.
Yes. And therefore not exploit the market's ignorance in a commercially more advantageous way.
Correct.
Yes. When you said it would take a huge campaign and probably a lawsuit to achieve re-education of the market, why did you think that?
Because the demand was already there for rigid board insulation and external wall cladding.
Yeah.
Kingspan had created that demand. Specifiers and contractors and subcontractors were willingly using that product behind a variety of cladding systems. So to go completely against the grain and say, hang on a minute, you've been specifying, you've been installing and using the product incorrectly, and here are the reasons why, would need some fairly significant investment, I would suggest. And
you refer to a lawsuit there, probably a lawsuit. Who would bring that lawsuit, did you think?
Kingspan.
For what?
For essentially saying that what we've said for the last however many years was technically incorrect.
Did you have any experience yourself or knowledge yourself of Kingspan's character for bringing lawsuits of that nature?
No.
Right. Does this mean that at this point you had thought about but discounted the idea of outing, as it were, case Kingspan K15, and what you discovered about how they had acquired the above 18-metre market for phenolic insulation?
I think it was an option, as with all of my research, that I put on the table for Celotex to consider.
Right. So outing them was an option, but it wasn't yours to decide on. Is that how you put it?
Honestly, I don't believe that they wanted to go down that route because of the investment that would be required on the huge campaign, as I suggested.
And the risk of being sued by Kingspan.
Yeah.
You then go on to say you then set out two options, and let's just look at those. First, test a standard A2 limited combustible panel, of which there are a few, a Lucabond A2 Marley Eternit, with a standard fire barrier system. If challenged on what system to use, we can happily state that our test used an A2 panel with a particular commonly used fire barrier, still not 100% confident in passing, as A2 is Euroclass classification derived from test data on reaction to fire testing. 2, opt for the Kingspan route and put a cement particle board as the cladding, use a standard fire barrier, good chance of passing they have, and CP board is good in terms of resistance to fire. Just looking at those two options, you don't rank them in seniority as you had done with the email of the 31st of October we saw earlier. Why is that?
Because it wasn't for me to do so. My remit was to research the market and feed that back in and seek decisions from my line manager and others within the senior team.
Right. And nor do you put forward the option, which was option 1 in your previous email, the 31st of October, which was testing with an ACM panel. Is that because you had discounted that even before taking the option to Paul Evans?
I think I've discounted that earlier in this email, hadn't I?
Yes. We can see what you say about it. But does that essentially take us to the reason why there are only two options in there?
Yes.
Right. And then you go on to say, however, what we do need to consider is, if we have two potential systems that could pass, how do these dictate route to market? What does an ASM CTC state to somebody who inquires? Just ASM CTC, that is a reference, I think, to Celotex people, either in the technical department or the marketing team. Is that?
Yes, so ASM Area Sales Manager and
Yeah.
CTC, Celotex Technical Centre.
Exactly. State to somebody who inquires. If we simply have the test report, we don't want to have to provide this as evidence. Do we in fact need to spend £25,000 to £30,000 for a BBA to be able to gain this document from LABC, which in my mind gives us very little chance of being challenged from building control? Do we partner with a few fire barrier manufacturers who have tested with K15 currently to gain confidence in the market that way? Or do we take the view that our product realistically shouldn't be used behind most cladding panels because in the event of a fire, it would burn? You see that?
Yes.
Now, in that last sentence there, are you really expressing your overall basic and honest assessment?
Yes, I believe I am.
Yes. And the rest was really just trying to find a way to get to the market despite your honest and basic assessment there.
Yeah, I don't think this email is the only example of me putting options on the table for Celotex to consider and putting opting out of 18-metre market as a viable option.
You thought it was a viable option, did you?
I think it's one that should have been considered.
In reality, was it in your mind at the time that it was the only option consistent with honesty and plain dealing?
Yes.
Yes. But nonetheless, it wasn't an option that Celotex pursued, was it?
No, and I think the response that I got from this email and the remarks that I got from other individuals within the business quickly indicated to me that regardless of what the system was that was going to be tested, that message would be diluted as it was with Kingspan.
Yes. In other words, if you were going to play in this market, you had to do so with cute wording.
Yes, yeah.
And therefore, the route to market would, as you knew at the time, involve some kind of deception or disingenuous presentation.
Unless a standard, realistic, representative system could have been tested, I think their launch plan and literature would have made a much bigger deal of a realistic cladding system had that have been achieved.
And it couldn't be achieved, could it?
It was demonstrated in the first test, wasn't it, that it couldn't be achieved?
No. Now, Paul Evans comes back to you, CEL 50718, and he says, great summary, and shows the real merit of good research and talking to the market. We are trying not to create a me too here, but if we do, it will be for the right reasons. Does the reference there, not trying to create a me too here, mean you are not aiming to replicate K15?
Correct.
What does that mean?
That was a phrase that Paul regularly used. I think if you look historically at Celotex's product development, it followed Kingspan. Kingspan led the way. Celotex developed products into a similar market. The view was that they weren't creating me toos, but the reality of it is that they were.
And he goes on to say, if we do, it will be for the right reasons. What would be the right reasons, did you understand?
Commercial, I would suggest.
Oh, I see. So not reasons to do with compliance with the regulations or life safety or anything like that?
No, I believe at this stage, and even before my involvement with the above 18 metre market, I think the business more generally had decided that that was the route that they were going to go down, and they would go down it regardless of how the product could pass.
And then he asks you in the second paragraph to put the whole 18-metre story into some slides and spend 15 minutes at the start bringing everyone up to speed on your work to date. Also have the flip chart there in case you need to draw anything up. We can then discuss how to go forward. And then he goes on to say, for me, for every amount of confidence we lose in the other system passing needs to be offset with the same amount or more competitive advantage that doing it this way delivers. Now, just unpacking that a bit, the 15 minutes at the start, was that a reference to the 4th of November meeting that had by then been scheduled?
I believe so, yes.
Right. We'll come to that in a moment. You say in your statement that you didn't actually attend that meeting, but you were specifically asked to attend and present some slides, and I think you went on to create some.
Yes.
Yes. And in that last paragraph that I've just read to you, where he says for every amount of confidence, etc., did you understand that Paul Evans meant that any decision not to follow the Kingspan model, which had a higher chance of passing, needed to be justified by the commercial advantage, or offset, if you like, by the commercial advantage of testing a more representative system?
Yes.
Yes. And that Mr. Evans himself was doubtful about the case for testing a more representative system?
Yes.
Yes. Now, moving on in a little bit in time, CEL 403001. This is you sending the meeting invitation for the 4th of November. CEL 403001. And you, I think, are listed there as one of the attendees, as you can see.
Yes.
Along with Craig Chambers, Rob Warren, Paul Evans, Jamie Hayes, in the boardroom. Craig Chambers was CEO at the time, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, yeah.
And Rob Warren was head of technical.
Correct.
Jamie Hayes, why was he invited?
Because he was part of the project team.
And just, he's coming to give evidence later this week, but just tell me, what precisely was his role in this at this stage?
He was assisting from a technical perspective regarding regulations and most product development teams consisted of a variety of different disciplines within the business.
Right. Can we go to CEL 30111199, please? And that's the first page, above 18-metre update. Were these the slides that you prepared?
I believe they were, yeah.
And if we just look at the first slide on page 2, we can see approved document B with, if we can have it blown up, paragraph 12.5, I cut and pasted there with a yellow highlight. External walls should either meet the guidance given in paragraphs 12.6 to 12.9 or meet the performance criteria given in the BRE report, BR135, for cladding systems using full-scale test data from BS8414, Part 2, Part 1 or Part 2. Now, can we proceed on the basis that, at least from this time, nobody within Celotex, at least who'd seen these slides, was under any illusion about what the regulation meant?
Correct.
Well, I say regulation, about what the guidance meant in ADB.
Yes.
Right. Now, can we go straight through this to slide 14, please, on page 14? Celotex options, and we can see that you set out there 5 options. Worst case scenario with field of application report. System route, limits scope, requires re-education. It's test and launch without a BBA and LABC. Test and launch with BBA and LABC. Opt out of above 18 metres. Now, these are the alternative routes that you thought Celotex could follow. And the first is worst case scenario with field of application report. What did you mean there by worst case scenario?
I don't know whether that was reference to the least fire-resistant cladding or the most fire-resistant cladding, looking at that now.
Right, so you can't help me with what you meant then?
No.
No. And the second option is, well, sorry, I should ask you, were these in order of your preferences?
No.
Why were they in the order they were in?
Probably because that's how they came into my head when I was creating the slides.
Right. And the second option down then is system route, limits scope, requires re-education. What did you mean when you said that this would require re-education?
The same point that I made earlier from the email.
Were you concerned that testing to the system route would lead to confusion in the absence of re-education?
Yes, I think it would have been very difficult to launch a product with a message around the system without re-educating.
Right. What did you have in mind by telling people, or in telling people about the system route by way of their re-education?
I don't know what I had specifically in mind, but all I knew it would be a major re-education and, as I've said, a big investment. Right.
Would the point of the re-education be, in simple terms, it's a system test, Celotex RS5000 can only be used in exactly the same system because that is what the guidance says?
Yes.
Right. And then it goes on, test and launch without BBA LABC. Presumably that was riskier than testing and launching with one.
Yes, I think there was some hesitancy, as there was with all certification within the business, to disclose any of that information. So without a BBA and a LABC certificate, the onus would be on the manufacturer to disclose a test report to the market, which they were hesitant to do.
Oh, I see. So when you say with and without, it's not that you don't have one, it's about disclosure.
I believe so, yeah. Right.
Then if we turn to the next slide, slide 15, page 15, we can see your assessment, I think, of the prospects of successfully achieving classification to BR135 with each option. And you put in there ACM panel with improved barrier system, less than 50%, A2 panel with standard barrier, 80%, cement particle with standard barrier, 90%. So it seems that your view, even then, was that there was a less than 50% chance that a BS8414 test pass would be possible with an ACM panel with an improved barrier system.
Correct.
Yeah. So was that basically discounted from then on?
Yes, at this meeting, yes.
At this meeting, right. And in contrast to that, if you look at the third bullet, it says a cement particle with standard barrier. That's what Kingspan had done, wasn't it?
Yes.
And that would give you a 90% chance of success.
Yes.
Yeah. But the A2 panel with standard barrier, only 80%. So what you called your last resort, doing a Kingspan, would still give you a better chance of passing the 8414 than your preferred choice, I think, which was the A2 panel with the standard barrier.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now, at paragraph 5.14 of your statement, if we just go to that, please, it's on page 10. You say there, I was aware that Rob and Paul expressed their views at this meeting. These were not entirely aligned. You say, I was aware. Were you not at that meeting?
I was, yes.
You were. So you were aware that they expressed their views at this meeting because you heard them express their views, presumably. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. Now, you go on to explain how the lineup worked. And you say prior to this meeting, I was already aware that Rob was clear in his views that BS8414 was a system test and that the test report relating to a successful test was only applicable to that particular system. I was aware of this as I had an actually informal chat with him. Craig Chambers and Paul were aware that Kingspan was selling successfully on the basis of one BS8414 test, as to which it provided only limited information to the market, and that Kingspan did not seem to be being asked for further details of their test. Craig Chambers and Paul's view was that adopting Rob's interpretation would limit sales and would not be a reflection of the market dynamics. I was told by Paul that Craig Chambers had said at the meeting on 4th November, and you say, which I did not attend, that there was no point in worrying about a test and its impact on sales until Celotex had passed it successfully. Now, I think it's not right, is it, that you didn't attend that meeting? I think you did, didn't you?
I believe I did, yes.
Yes. So that needs to be corrected in your statement. And when you say, I was told by Paul that Craig Chambers had said, what you then record there, is it in fact something that you heard Craig Chambers say himself?
It was, yes, and that was primarily the point of the meeting. I knew that there was contrasting views within the business between Rob and Paul. Craig was obviously the managing director, and that is something that stuck with me, really.
Yeah. Now, we can see you say in paragraph 5.14 that you didn't attend that meeting. You also say the same thing in paragraph 5.13. If we go back a page, please. You say in the second line there that you didn't attend that meeting. I think you now accept that you did. Can you just explain why you've changed your evidence about that?
It's just recollection, I think.
Having been shown the diary invite.
Yes.
Right. Did you present the slides at that meeting?
I don't know whether I presented the slides or they would. Well, I definitely produced the slides. I'm not sure whether I presented them.
Right. Can we get back to paragraph 5.14? And you say there that Paul Evans and Craig Chambers, you say, felt that Rob Warren's interpretation would limit sales and not be a reflection of market dynamics. What did you understand them to mean by not a reflection of market dynamics?
Not a reflection of how the market was operating currently.
So were Mr. Evans and Mr. Chambers therefore in favour of one of the other approaches?
They were concerned that a system route would go against what was already in place in terms of market dynamics.
Right. It's a slightly oblique answer. Is the position actually, just straightforwardly, simply this, that Rob Warren basically said, look, you need to do a system test because that's what 8414 says, and you can't market it as anything wider than the system. But Craig Chambers and Paul Evans said that that was basically uncommercial and would limit their sales.
Yes.
Yes. So this wasn't a genuine debate about the meaning of approved document B or the meaning of BR135 or the build-up of 8414. This was just about whether or not you complied on the one hand, or whether or not you bent the rules to make more money on the other.
Yes.
Yes. Now, the option eventually selected by Celotex was to test with an A2 board and then obtain a LABC approval, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
Do you accept that that was a similar approach to the one adopted by Kingspan?
It was similar, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Because if we look at the final slide of this presentation, please, on page 16, I'm sorry to get back to it. This is at CEL 301199. There it is. Considerations, proof of compliance to BR135, and then second bullet point, literature wording, CTC and ASM response. Literature wording there, what did you mean by that?
I think there was a conversation that took place throughout all of this initial research regarding, one, can we viably pass a BS 8414 test, and two, how the business would then take that forward and market that product. And there was so much debate regarding those two, and obviously differing views, that's what sort of prompted Craig to say we're worrying about how we take a product forward that we haven't even got approval for.
Right, thank you. Just unpacking that a little bit more, does that mean that there was discussion at this meeting about how to word the product literature in order to be able to give the impression of a much broader suitability for use of RS5000 than as had been tested?
I think there was a general conversation about how much of the testing information the business disclosed.
And about how the literature was to be worded?
Yes.
So presentation?
Presentation, tagline, yeah, everything
Right.
really. Adverts.
This was a decision then about how to word the literature in order to present things in a particular way and also not reveal other things.
Yes.
I'm saying that, but what's your recollection?
That's as I said, there was a lot of consideration given to the eventual outcomes of a test and the details of those tests and how that could then be taken forward.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, we've come to a new topic, and it's now 11:15. I won't finish the new topic in 5 minutes. It might be convenient.
Would that be a better point for you?
It's as convenient moment as any.
Let's have a break now. Mr. Roper, we're taking our break this morning slightly earlier than usual because Council's reached a convenient point.
Okay.
So we'll stop now. We'll come back at 11:30, please.
Fine.
And as I told you last week, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it while you're out of the room.
That's fine.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to go to the usher, please. Good. Thank you. 11:30, please. Yes, would you ask Mr. Roper to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Roper,
Yes.
you ready to carry on?
Yeah. Hi.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roper, can we just go back a little bit in time, but forward in topic, to designing the test? And at paragraph 5.7 of your statement, if we can just have that up there, on page 8 of your statement, you say, on the morning of the 30th of October 2013, so that's about 5 days or so before the 4th of November meeting, I was introduced by Ian Lathbury, an ASM at Celotex, to Graham Smith of Simcoe. He was keen to work with Celotex and offered to help with the construction of the test rig. Now let's just look on at CEL 2090, 2090, please. And I'd like to go in that to page 3. This is an email earlier in the month from Ian Lathbury. And if you look at the, I think you need the bottom probably of page 2 for this. It's an email of the 10th of October from Ian Lathbury to Graham Smith at Simcoe, and relates to a meeting they'd had. And if you go over to page 3, you can see that there's some bold text. And in the first bold paragraph, you can see that he says, note that K15's certificate also states that the product can be used in types of wall cladding, including rain screen curtain walling, which are outside the scope of this certificate. You see that? And then halfway down the next paragraph, 5 lines down, he says, we know from K15's BBA and literature that they have only tested to BS 84141, which is onto masonry, but by wording their literature cutely, the perception is that they can be used on an SFS frame structures above 18 metres. The sheathing board must be as sound in terms of fire protection as a masonry wall, which we know a calcium silicate board is. However, most would opt for a cement particle board, which are cheaper and more commonly used, but classified as limited combustibility, not non-combustible. Our system will be determined by what sheathing board is used in our fire test, of which the details are still to be finalised. Hope this helps. John. And then underneath that, you can see Ian Lathbury's name. Now, just clear this up for me, if you wouldn't mind, please. Who actually sent that email? Was it you or Ian Lathbury, or was it Ian Lathbury cutting and pasting something you'd sent him?
You're referencing the bold text?
Yeah, let's focus on that, yes.
Well, I presume I sent it, looking at that.
Right, I see. And when you say there, in that third paragraph, by wording their literature cutely, was that your impression, or are you quoting from what someone had said to you?
I think that was the general view of those that were involved with the above 18 metre projects.
And by the word cutely, did you mean that Kingspan were wording their literature to give the impression, false impression, that K15 could be used more widely than they had tested?
I think that what was clear is they'd only carried out a test to part 1, but from memory, even some of the diagrams and images that were used in their data sheet and even in their BBA certificate suggested or demonstrated the product's use onto an SFS frame as opposed to a masonry substrate, which we know part 1 is. Right.
So that's a yes to my question, but on the basis that they'd only passed part 1 but were giving the impression, cutely, that it could be used in a part 2 application.
Yes.
Yes. Now, returning back to your direct contact with Simcoe, I think you then sent an email following your introductory meeting early that day, 30th of October. CEL 50711, please. And I'd like to go to page 3 in that. The email starts on page 2, just to show you where it begins and what its context is. It's a follow-up email from you after a meeting with him, and you had some further queries which had sprung to your mind on the way back from the meeting. If you look at the foot of page 1, we can see his answers. Those are questions, and his answers come the next day. And if you go to the foot of page 1, you can see what he says. And he just says, Jonathan, responses below. Now, if we go back to the page 3, you can see that there's page 2. Question 1, do architects generally specify the material brand of cladding to be used on each project, or is this again driven by main/subcontractors? Now, his answer, I'm afraid it's in the same colour, but is nearly always specified, but every year more common that facade panel is revised for VE purposes. So just thinking back to your 1st of November email, is that where you got the point you made in your 1st of November email about value engineering from?
Yes.
Yes. And then ditto question number 2, we talked about having to obviously submit paperwork relating to above 18-metre testing to building control. If you use K15 on a job, do you have to submit paperwork, or is it the responsibility of somebody else? And what paperwork is generally submitted for insulation, BBA, test reports, etc.? Question mark. And then if you go to page 3, we can see his answer. Typically, yes, we have to issue BBA certificates or fire testing at Warrington/Chiltern Fire or similar. Even if insulation is specified, most large cladding projects are undertaken by a facade contractor who takes responsibility for the design. Therefore, critical facade contractor has approval for whatever he proposes. And again, was that the basis for your essentially giving that advice and passing that on to Paul Evans in your 1st of November email?
Yes.
Yes. And then your third question, you say, I'll have a conversation with the BRE tomorrow and my peers in here on how quickly we can move this project on. If you're willing to help install the system, do you have a design team in-house if we sent you through our requirements, i.e. fire barriers, cement boards, cladding panel, and the test structure details? Answer, we do, but they are extremely busy getting ready for the number of jobs starting on site December. This is the worst possible time for us internally, as busy designing and planning for these works, but have possible labour available. Can't promise anything, as I do not want to let you down like Celotex. If you have details or sketches what is required, I can review and ask if one of my designers can do extra overtime to what they're doing now. That was how it was left. Just after that then, to what extent were Simco actually involved in the design of the test, having offered their services in that way?
I believe they produced drawings for test 1. And then they subsequently provided labour to install the rig on both occasions.
Yeah. And just scrolling on then to January 2014, CEL 50795. This is an email from you to Graham Smith at Simco, where you thank him for the confidentiality agreement. And if we look down the email chain, and I'm not sure we need to, we can see that Simco had sent back a confidentiality agreement which Celotex had demanded, and asked for proof that our FR5000 was of limited combustibility. It seems to have been for another client. But looking at the first page, we can see your response of the 22nd of January, which was to provide the data sheet confirming Class 0 fire performance, as you can see in the 3rd paragraph. Why did you give Mr. Smith the data about Class 0, given that he was after proof of limited combustibility?
I don't know, is the honest answer. I think generally that's what was issued with the data sheet.
Right. Looking at note, you say building control may ask for proof of passing BR135 testing, which will happen over the next 2 weeks, but views on what actually constitutes limited combustibility differs, dependent on who you talk to. We believe we need to demonstrate compliance to approved document B by passing BR135, the fire test. Others may simply want proof that it's Class 0, but we would not advise Simco installing our product until we've passed BR135. Now, were you telling him that some of your clients, Celotex's clients, thought that Class 0 as a classification meant limited combustibility?
Yeah, I think there was a perception at the time that within a certain few that Class O meant limited combustibility.
Was that something you yourself had come across in your time at Celotex, or something that you had been told by others within Celotex?
Yeah, it's something that I've been told, and I think I raised the issue with Rob, and he referenced the diagram in approved document B, which I think we saw on Thursday, which I think relates to the external cladding rather than in the insulation. But I think that's where the misinterpretation came from.
Right. Wasn't the point here that the reason Celotex needed classification to BR135 was precisely because FR5000, as it then was not a material of limited combustibility?
Yes, correct.
Yes. And the fact that it might be Class 0 was not relevant?
No.
I mean, yes, it wasn't relevant.
It wasn't relevant, no.
Did you have any concerns at the time about Simcoe's apparently limited understanding of the concept of limited combustibility?
No, I didn't.
You didn't? That didn't lead you to have any concerns about accepting any design recommendations from them either? Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. Now, in your statement at paragraph 5.23, this is at page 11, if we can just have that up, please, you refer to an email of the 8th of November to Simcoe, and you say there, Simcoe had previously advised that Celotex needed panels with good levels of fire resistance, and Marley Eternit panels were very similar to cement particle boards and had good fire performance. Now, cement particle board is what Kingspan had tested, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And you've already explained that, in your view, Kingspan's testing was unrepresentative of what was used in the market. That's right, isn't it?
Correct.
Yes. And yet, despite this, Celotex was opting to test a panel which they considered to be very similar to the Kingspan panel.
Similar in nature, in material. Marley Eternit is fibre cement, so it's a cement-based product, but it's not a building board, it's a decorative cladding panel.
I see. So when you say similar to cement particle boards, similar in what sense?
The formulation of the product,
Right.
It's a cement-based board.
Was Marley Eternit similarly unrepresentative in the way that Kingspan's cement particle board had been?
No.
So it was more representative, you
It
thought?
was, yeah.
Right. Why did you decide to use a Marley Eternit panel as opposed to an Alucobond panel or any of the others that you'd been considering?
Because I think that, as I've said previously, there wasn't enough confidence in an ACM panel. Following the discussions with Simcoe, they suggested that Marley Eternit were similar in nature to cement particle boards, albeit a decorative facade, and Marley were a relatively well-established brand. I believe the sales director at Celotex had previously worked with the sales director of Marley Eternit, and so the link was there.
Right. Marley Eternit Natura, you say, was a decorative facade.
Yes.
But it was nonetheless a cementitious fibreboard, I think, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Correct.
Right. Did the fact that it was a decorative facade not give you pause for thought, looking back at the SOTEC meeting that you'd had in the June and the October of 2013, when John Eggington had expressed his views about decorative panels?
Yeah, I think I fed the feedback from Simcoe's meeting back into the business, and there was clearly a risk associated with the Marley Eternit decorative facades based on what John Eggington had said previously. But equally, there was a drive to try and test a more representative system.
Was there any aspect of the Natura panel which was metallic?
No.
Right. So the decorative nature of it wasn't the same, is this right, as the metal panels which you'd been discussing with SOTEC?
Correct.
Now, we know that the first test was carried out in February 2014, and I just want to look at that with you. You say that you were in attendance at that test with Rob Warren. Is that right?
Yes.
Was Jamie Hayes also there?
I didn't state that in my statement, but I've seen evidence that suggests that he was.
Yes, indeed, he does. But what was your recollection? Or what is your recollection whether Mr. Hayes was there?
Looking back at it now, yes, I believe he was there with some members of IFC.
With representatives from IFC. Do you remember who that was?
I don't, off the top of my head.
All right. It's right, isn't it, that the test was extinguished after 26 minutes?
Correct.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 5.27 at page 12, and I don't think there's a need, well, it's there now, you say in the third line, there was an obvious failure as the flames reached the top of the test rig before the specified time. Was it your view at the time that the failure was obvious?
Yes.
Was Phil Clark of the BRE present throughout the test?
He was, yes.
Do you recall talking to him before the test?
Yes.
Do you remember what was said?
I think we were just trying to ascertain what constitutes a pass and a fail. There was a big clock in front of the test rig. If it got to 30 minutes and it hadn't been extinguished, then there was a good chance that the rig had passed. Equally, if the flames were protruding the top of the rig, that was a clear sign that it was a failure.
Now, in paragraph 528 and 529, you record discussions with Phil Clark, and in the second line of paragraph 528, you say, Phil told me he shared Rob's view that the insulation had performed relatively well, but that the cladding panel had cracked, and that once fire had entered the cavity, there was not much that could be done. And then in paragraph 529, you say, following the end of the test, Rob, Ian Cooper, Phil and I had a discussion whilst at the BRE testing centre. Ian Cooper was IFC, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, he was, yeah.
Phil said he'd seen worse fails and suggested that Celotex might want to strengthen the outside of the test rig in order to counteract the cracking of the Marley Eternit panels. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Where you record him saying that he, Phil Clark, shared the view that the insulation had performed relatively well, but once fire had entered the cavity, there was not much could be done. Was it he who suggested that Celotex might want to consider strengthening the outside of the rig?
Yeah, I think we sort of looked to Phil because that's what he did on a day-to-day basis, really. He carried out 8414 tests, so Rob and I could see that, as I've described there, once the fire managed to get through the 8mm panel and into the cavity, that's when it really started to take shape and end up flaming at the top of the rig. So we were interested to get Phil's views. And please, bear in mind at this stage, this is the first large-scale fire test that Celotex had ever undertaken. So all of the previous claims around PIR boards just charring and not contributing to flame spread, etc., it seemed to confirm those initial views.
It looks as if it was you who suggested that Marley Eternit panels were available in 12mm, in addition to the 8mm used in the test.
Yes.
That had come from you, and you say that Phil responded that he thought that thickening the panels to 12mm might suffice.
Yes.
So that was his response. You then go on to say, Phil also joked that Celotex could use a 6mm cement particle board like Kingspan, but I knew that this was not what the business wanted. Did he actually mention Kingspan by name, do you recall?
Yeah, he did, yeah.
He did?
Yeah.
Did he explain to you exactly how Kingspan had used the 6mm cement particle board?
Not in detail, no. He just referenced the 6mm cement particle board as the outside cladding.
Right. And that was a reference, as you understood it, to the cement particle board Kingspan had used in its historic 8414 test?
Yes.
Yeah. Why did you think that Phil Clark was joking?
Because I think that he understood my concerns relating to using a decorative facade. I had conversations when I was at the BRE that reference that exact line. Oh, we could just use a 6mm cement particle board like Kingspan, couldn't we? To which he confirmed that that was the case. So I don't know why he joked after the first test, because it was clear at that stage that that wasn't the route that we were going to go down.
When you say he joked that Celotex could use a 6mm cement particle, I'm just trying to understand why you thought what he was saying was a joke. Was it because actually you all knew that the use of the 6mm cement particle board that Kingspan had used was a joke?
Unrealistic, yes.
Unrealistic. Well, I don't want to coin a phrase perhaps, but a cheat?
Manipulation of the test details, yeah. It's
Okay.
I expressed those views too, Phil.
Okay. You weren't in any doubt, though, were you, that Phil Clark... Well, you weren't in any doubt, were you, about Phil Clark's attitude to the reliability of the Kingspan test using cement particle board?
No.
No. Now, you then go on to say in paragraph 5.31 of your statement, if we go over the page, you say, following our internal discussions, I sought some advice from IFC and the BRE. I spoke to Phil about thickening the cladding panel to 12mm. And then you go on to say, I believe we also spoke about the option of strengthening the fire barrier level with a 2-panel solution, because it appeared from the February test that the cladding panel had cracked and fallen away, which enabled the fire to jump around the fire barrier at level 2. I do not think that Phil suggested anything specific in this regard. Now, when you say that you spoke to him about the option of strengthening the fire barrier level with a 2-panel solution, what was his response? Do you remember?
I don't, no. I recall the conversation and the context of the conversation, but I don't recall his response.
Right. The 2-panel solution came from you, did it?
Now, the 2-panel solution referred to, again, initial references of a fire barrier that Kingspan had used previously that was no longer available.
You say in paragraph 531 that this conversation with Phil Clark followed our internal discussions. Was this separate? Was this later than the test day, 14th of February 2014?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
When did you have the conversation with Phil Clark to which you are referring here at paragraph 5.31?
I'm not sure of the specific date.
Do you know who was party to it, apart from you and Phil Clark?
I don't know.
Was Jamie Hayes privy to that conversation?
I don't believe he was, no.
What about Paul Evans?
Paul never came to the test rig.
Right. Do you think this conversation was at a meeting or on the phone or
I'd be guessing, so I don't know.
Right. Now, I'll come back to this point in a moment, but can I just go to Jamie Hayes' statement? This is CEL 3010154. And I'd just like to look at paragraph 54 with you. He says, and this is a reference to the test day itself, and he says, myself, JR, PE, and RW, that's you, Paul Evans, and Rob Warren, did not understand at the time that flames out of the top of the structure would constitute a test failure. I drove back to the office with JR and RW. We discussed the fact that we felt as though the fact that the test had been stopped before the 30-minute mark suggested the rig had not passed, but that if the rig could pass the thermocouple data, it might just pass. Everyone seemed really excited about this prospect. Do you remember that conversation?
I do, yes.
Is he right in his recollection about what happened in it?
Yes, I believe he is.
And at paragraph 55, he goes on to say, JR telephoned PE from the car as he wanted to find out how the first test had gone. He seemed extremely keen to find out from the BRE as soon as possible what the outcome of the first test was. There was a lot of emotion from JR and PE related to the first test result. I felt that this was linked to the pressure from Saint-Gobain regarding the budget and following further discussions in the car regarding the further £25,000 that would be required for another test. It was apparent to me that the second test would be likely should the first test results show a failure. Do you agree with him, as he says there, that that first of all that you telephoned Paul Evans from the car?
That's correct.
And that's because Paul Evans wanted to know as soon as possible what the result was. Do you remember what you told Paul Evans?
I told him that exactly what I saw, that the test was terminated after 26 minutes.
What did Paul Evans say to you?
Probably, does that constitute a pass or a fail? You don't get a definitive answer from the BRE there and then, but having spoken to Phil prior to the test taking place, I expected that result to come back as a failure.
And he goes on to say there was a lot of emotion from JR and PE related to the first test result. Is he right about that?
I'm not sure what he's referring to in terms of emotion. I relayed the information back to Paul as I saw it, really.
Right. And what about his view that whatever it is you said was linked to pressure from Saint-Gobain regarding the budget?
Well, I think
discussion about that?
I think there was discussions around budgets, and I wasn't sure. I mean, these are expensive tests in the nature, as you can see, 25,000 or there or thereabouts. I wasn't sure whether Celotex or Saint-Gobain would commit to an additional test given the level of expenditure that had been.
Right. Just go back to paragraph 5.29 in your statement, please. Your statement at page 12. You say, towards the foot of the page there, I do not recall any mention of any further possible modifications to the rig during this discussion, and that's at the end of the test. At the time, I thought this might be the end of the above 80-metre project, as we had exhausted our budget, and it had only ever been envisaged that we would conduct one test. But you also say, if you go back 2 paragraphs, same page, at the end of paragraph 5.27, you say, I do not recall being particularly surprised by this failure, as it was Celotex's first attempt at the test. And I'd just like to try to see if you can reconcile those two statements. Given that you weren't surprised by the failure, are you saying that you never expected Celotex to pass that test?
I wasn't overly optimistic, no.
Given that you weren't surprised that it had failed the test, does it mean that, given that you would only conduct one test, you felt that this test was the one and only chance?
Yes.
Right. Can we go to CEL 50842? This is an email from you on the 17th of February 2014, so 3 days after the failed test on the 14th, to IFC, Parina Patel and David Cooper. And you say in the second main paragraph, I've spoken to Phil this morning, and he sees no reason why a classification report cannot be issued, as it is in his opinion that extending the test to the full duration of 30 minutes rather than stopping at 25 minutes would have made little difference, and as shown attached, we meet the performance criteria of BR135 in not exceeding 600 degrees within the first 15 minutes. Depending on how Phil's peers at the BRE receive this, it may be useful if we could set aside a date in the diary in which you could dial in to discuss your view from the test. Given what you said in your statement, that it was an obvious fail and you weren't surprised that the first test had failed, Were you surprised by what you record, by what Mr. Clark said to you as you record here? Were you surprised by what he'd said?
Yes, I mean, I'm looking at that now, and that's the first time I've seen that email in 6 years, and
Right.
it surprises me as I read it now. Yes.
Yeah. Do I take it from that you don't remember this conversation?
No.
Do you remember a conversation in which you were surprised that Phil Clark had suggested that you might pass?
No.
Right.
No.
Now, we know that there was a decision made to retest following the failure of the test in February. Do you know when that decision was made?
I think there was a discussion internally. Myself, Jamie, Paul, Rob. I don't know whether Craig was involved in that discussion, but what we'd seen had been fed back in, really, that the insulation, in our view, had performed okay, and that the 8mm panel had prevented flames entering the cavity for a certain period of time. And really, there were two suggestions in that meeting that then led to a second test being carried out.
Do you know when that discussion took place?
I don't know the specific date, no.
Do you know who was the ultimate decision maker about whether or not a second test should take place?
It would have been either Paul or Rob, most likely Paul because of the budget.
What was the basis on which that decision was taken? Do you know?
I think because the first test was viewed as a narrow fail, really.
What gave you confidence? Well, did you have confidence that Celotex would be able to pass on the second attempt?
It wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, the first test. And Phil's comments made me, I guess, a little bit more confident that there was a chance of passing an 8414 test.
Those are the comments we've seen already in your statement about thickening the Marley Eternit panels to 12 millimetres.
Correct. Yes, there was two suggestions that came out of that meeting. Rob suggested that we could take the route of moving away from the 8mm Marley Eternit and using the 12mm Marley Eternit, which we knew was available. And the second suggestion was from Jamie to incorporate an additional layer at fire barrier level.
Right. You say Rob suggested you could move away from 8mm and use 12mm. Is that right? The actual suggestion came from Rob Warren, did it? Not you?
That's right, yes.
I see. What research was done into the prospects of passing before the second test was booked?
I don't think there was much more research done other than taking on board the comments following the first test.
Right. Given that you had expected the budget for testing to be used up, was it not surprising to you that it was possible to retest so soon on the basis merely of a thickening of the external panels?
Yeah, probably was surprising, actually, yeah,
Right.
in reflection.
Do you know how securing the funding for the second test was gone about?
I think Paul or myself spoke to Joe, so from memory the test fees came out of the development budget rather than the marketing budget.
I see. And Joe is Joe Mahoney, is it?
Joe Mahoney, correct, yes.
And what was his role?
He was research and development manager at the time.
Did he have the purse strings
He did,
over the development budget?
over the development budget,
That
yes.
meant not going back to Saint-Gobain, is that right?
Correct.
I see. And how did you persuade Joe Mahoney that a second test was worth it?
I don't think I did persuade him. I think he was just asked whether he had an additional £25,000 left in his budget,
And he did.
and he did, yeah.
And he agreed to spend it on the second test.
Correct.
Did he not ask for any data or any forecast in order to justify releasing those funds?
No, that wasn't unusual. I mean, a lot of the spend from the marketing department actually came out of the development budget, generally. So.
Yeah, be that as it may, to your knowledge, did Jonah Mahoney not say to you, well, in order for me to release another £25,000, I'm going to need some sort of concrete basis on which I can think it's reasonable to do so?
I don't believe he did, no.
Really? Okay. Now, I want to ask you some questions about the second test. If you go back to your statement, please, at page 12, we look at paragraph 5.24, please. And I think I probably need the bottom of page 11 first, just to give you the context. You say there that your preference for the panels to be 8 millimetres in thickness because our team thought this was more representative of what was used in the market. However, if only 12 millimetres was available, then that would be fine. Paul, Rob Warren and Jamie Hayes were aware of this choice of board and the decision as to thickness. So, is the reason why 8 millimetres was used in the first test that it was more representative of what was used in the market?
I think they were cautious about using a cladding panel that came across as too thick, basically, yeah. So I think 8mm was deemed to be more representative.
Yes, but in the second test, using 12 millimetres, that might undermine that and make it impractical or less practical for the test system to be representative of what was being used in the market.
Correct, if that was the route that the business were going to go down.
Right. And if we go to page 13 of your statement and look at paragraph 5.32, we can see here, I said I'd come back to this, Paul, Rob, Jamie Hayes and I subsequently discussed two options. One, increase the thickness of the panel to 12 millimetres, or increase the panel thickness and use a double panel system on the fire barrier using a magnesium oxide board. We decided on option 2 because we thought that such a system stood the best chance of passing the test. Who was it who came up with the idea of using a double panel system on the fire barrier using a magnesium oxide board?
I believe it was Jamie Hayes.
Jamie Hayes. Do you remember when he suggested that?
At that meeting, I believe.
We might be able to date it. Can we look at CEL 50881, please? Here is an appointment message in the Outlook system for a meeting on the 31st of March 2014, required Jamie Hayes. Is that the meeting at which you would have you discussed the use of a 6 millimetre magnesium oxide board?
The only thing that concerns me there is that Rob and Paul were not invited.
No, true. Does that trigger a recollection about when that meeting might have happened, or was it not that meeting?
I don't believe it was that meeting, no,
Right.
because they were present.
Now, apart from Paul Evans, Rob Warren and Jamie Hayes, who else was aware within Celotex of the suggestion that the second test should involve the 6 millimetre magnesium oxide board?
Just us four, I believe.
Right. Did you consider at that time, whenever that was, that it was first discussed, that it would reflect a typical build-up of a cladding system generally used in the market?
No, I think the general view amongst those that knew that that was the route that they were going to go down, knew it was unreflective.
Right. Now, you say that it was just you, Rob Warren and Jamie Hayes. What about Craig Chambers? Was he also aware of this discussion about 6 millimetres?
I don't know, if I'm honest with you.
Well, the reason I ask you is if you go to paragraph 5.32 of your statement, you say halfway down, Craig Chambers may also have been present at that discussion, although I cannot now clearly recall. Looking back on it now, and the material I'm now bringing to life, I hope, in front of you, do you have a better recollection of whether Craig Chambers was privy to the conversation about the use of the 6 millimetre magnesium oxide board?
I don't, I'm afraid.
Right. Were you aware that magnesium oxide was non-combustible?
I was, yes.
You were. Was there anybody present at the discussion you've identified at paragraph 5.32 who disagreed with the approach of using a double panel system using a magnesium oxide board?
No.
And at the end of that paragraph, you say, in any event, Paul said he would need to discuss this in greater detail at the board meeting. Paul also said that a discussion with Joe Mahoney would be required to secure the budget for a further test. Do you know whether, given the answers you've given me earlier about the discussions with Joe Mahoney, whether he was told that a 6mm magnesium oxide board be inserted into the test to improve the chances of passing as a means of securing the budget from him?
I don't know. I don't think from my recollection of my time at Celotex that Joe would have put up any resistance to providing money out of his budget to the marketing department.
Right. So was it your understanding that the board approved the design of the test as well as the decision to retest?
Sorry, can you rephrase
Yes. Looking at paragraph 5.32, where you're recording the fact that Paul Evans told you that he would need to discuss this in greater detail at the board meeting, is it your recollection that Paul Evans was going to tell the board about the design of the test, including the 6mm, and not only the fact that they needed to make a decision to retest?
Yes.
Yes. And was there any discussion at this time about whether the proposed presence of 6mm of magnesium oxide would be disclosed in the test reports?
I think that during the discussion that took place between myself, Paul, Rob and Jamie, that the concern from Paul's side primarily was that it wasn't representative, and that was one of the key drivers in what he saw that could have been used as a competitive advantage had the product passed. So there were some reservations from his side, but as I said before, I quickly understood that any references to the system would be diluted, and I could foresee the business going down the Kingspan route at that stage.
Yeah. Had there been any concerns as a result of the February test about the cavity barriers that had been used?
I think what became apparent is that the fire barriers that were installed on the first test only worked by being activated by heat or smoke or fire, and expanding upon the inside face of cladding panel. And I think there was some concern around the ability for that intumescent on the end of the fire barrier to expand and close the cavity. So that there were some reservations around there.
Did you discuss fire barrier designs alongside the use of 6mm magnesium oxide?
Yes, I believe we did, yeah.
So was the use of magnesium oxide a way of overcoming the problem with the cavity barriers not expanding fully?
Yeah, I think what I learned at the time, what I still believe now, is that the performance of those fire barriers are entirely dependent on the fire resistance of the cladding panel that they expand onto.
Do you remember having a meeting with a cavity fire barrier manufacturer?
Yes.
You do. Who was that?
Siderise.
Siderise. Did you go to the meeting with Siderise?
Yes.
And do you remember what you discussed?
I think, I believe Jamie was present there as well. And I think we discussed our concerns with Chris of Siderise.
Was that Chris Mort?
Chris Mort, yes.
Yes.
About the ability for their product to firstly expand sufficiently to close the cavity, and then to work if the cladding panel wasn't there in the first place.
Did you have any discussion with Chris Mort about the proposed use of 6mm magnesium oxide?
I don't know, if I'm honest with you. I don't know.
Can we then turn to the test in May 2014, 2nd of May 2014? And at page 13 of your statement, on the same page we're on at the moment, you go on to say, I do not recall participating in any discussion about changing or reducing the ventilation gaps in the system from the first to the second test. The thickness of the insulation was the same and the same brackets were going to be used. The only changes between the first test and the second test that I was aware of was the thickening of the Marlier Turnip panel from 8mm to 12mm and the use of a 6mm magnesium oxide board at the fire barrier at level 2 and at the top of the test rig. Were you also not aware of the fact that at those points, level 2 and the top of the test rig, an 8mm Marlier Turnip panel would be used?
I was aware, yes.
You were. So in fact there were 3 changes, not just 2. Is this right? Thickening of the Marlier Turnip panel from 8 to 12, use of the 6mm magnesium oxide board, where you've said, and also in the same positions the use of 8mm Marlier Turnip.
Correct.
Yeah. So we could correct that paragraph, can we, in your statement?
Yes.
Yes. Is there any reason why you omitted that reference to the 8mm at those points?
No, there isn't.
All right. Now, do you know, can you remember when those changes were actually agreed?
No, I don't recall the specific date, but yeah, I would imagine that the meeting that took place previously with Paul and Rob most likely led to that decision.
Right. And what about Craig Chambers? From to the best of your recollection, was he involved in making that ultimate decision to make those changes?
He would have.
Right.
Things. I don't know whether Paul disclosed what the changes were between the first and the second test to Craig.
Very well. Can we then look at CEL 401109, please? This is the BRE final test report of the 1st of August 2014. This is the test report as opposed to the classification report, just to make that clear to you. And we can see on the second page, if we just pick up page 2, that it's signed by Phil Clark and authorised by Tony Baker. See that?
Yes.
Now, can we look at page 13 in that document? This is figure 3, the system prior to testing. We can see that there are some areas of cladding which are white, the bottom 3 panels, and then an area of cladding which is orange.
Yes.
2 areas, in fact, which are orange. One at level, what in fact was level 2, and one at the very top of the rig. Are those orange panels the 8mm Marlier Turnip Natura panels?
Correct.
Yeah. And the rest are the white 12-metre panels, aren't they?
Yes.
And does that mean that with the magnesium oxide behind... Well, sorry, I should ask you. And was the magnesium oxide panel, the 6mm magnesium oxide panel, sitting just behind the orange panels we see on that picture?
Correct.
And so 8 plus 6 is 14, as opposed to 12. Does that mean that the orange panels protruded very slightly from flush with the 12mm Marlier Turnip panels by 2mm?
Yes, yeah.
Can we just see that on the left-hand side there in the return wall?
Yes, you can. I mean, the reflection on the image isn't very good, but
Yeah.
yes, you could see the magnesium oxide protruding there.
Yes. Now, we'll come back to this report in due course. Can I go, please, to CEL 50892, please? CEL 50892. This is an email from you to Matt Taylor at FGF Limited. And it's dated the 2nd of April 2014, and it responds to his email to you of the same day at the bottom of that page. And he's telling you there that he can do 8mm panels and 12mm panels. And it follows on from a discussion I don't think I need to show you. Well, perhaps we should just look at it, actually. If you look at page 2, the point is, I think you originally asked for 6mm panels, didn't you?
Yes.
Yes, and we don't need to go to that. But you were told, in a nutshell, by Mr. Taylor that it wasn't available at that depth, so you settled for 8.
Correct.
That's the message from these emails, isn't it, I think?
Yes.
And was the decision to use a thinner layer to make it less noticeable that there was something else behind it?
Yes, it was to try and make it a consistent 12mm.
Yeah. So as to conceal the presence of the 6mm magnesium oxide board to anybody looking either at the rig or at a photograph of the rig in a later report?
It was to prevent any stepping out of the rig.
Yeah, and therefore to see off any prospect of anybody asking questions about why there was a step out, as you put it.
Correct.
Either looking at the rig itself or any later photograph.
Yes.
Yes. Did that not strike you at the time as dishonest?
Yes, it did, yeah.
But you went along with it?
I went along with a lot of actions at Celotex that, looking back on reflection, were completely unethical, and one that I probably didn't potentially consider the impact of at the time. I was, as we've said, I was 22, 23, first job. I thought this was standard practice, albeit it did sit very uncomfortably with me.
Yes, thank you. And the reason for using magnesium oxide here at the fire barriers at level 2 is that one of the criteria for classification to BR135 is that the temperature at the level 2 thermocouples should not or must not exceed 600 centigrade.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Yes. So by including combustible material here, Celotex increased its chances of satisfying that requirement.
Correct.
Yes. And does the same apply to the use of magnesium oxide at the top of the rig, that flames overtopping the rig would lead to failure?
Yeah, I think the two biggest criteria with the level 2 thermocouples and the, as seen on the first test, flames protruding the top of the rig.
Yeah.
Mr. Millett, you may have inadvertently given the wrong impression. You asked the witness whether by including combustible material, Celotex increased its chances. Is that what you meant?
No. I'm grateful.
I think you
I meant non-combustible.
Well, all right, non-combustible.
I'll ask the question again.
Well, I just think the transcript it's a very important point, and I think the transcript ought to reflect
Yes,
accurately both the question and
yes,
the answer.
no, indeed. I'm grateful, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask the question again. I think you understood my question, but I'll put it again for the transcript. Is it right that you understood that by including non-combustible material here, you, or Celotex, increased its chances of satisfying the requirement in BR135 that the temperature at the level 2 thermocouples does not exceed 600 centigrade?
Correct.
Yes. And similarly, the reason to include a magnesium oxide strip at the top would be to avoid flames overtopping the rig, which would lead to failure, as the first test had done.
Yeah, it was to have something that the fire barrier could expand to that would stay in situ.
And the reason for using the thicker 12mm Eternit boards was that would make it harder for fire to enter the cavity.
Correct.
Yes. Did you think that those design features were acceptable? I think, given what you've said just a moment ago, they were not.
No, they weren't. And I was fully aware at that stage that the rig was being over-engineered to achieve a pass.
You say, I think, that you sourced the components for the May test. Can you tell us where you got the magnesium oxide 6mm boards from?
Yes, from the same company that produced the sheathing board that went onto the steel frame. Versaliner, I think they're called.
Right. I don't think we're able to find any delivery notes of it. Do you know when it was delivered to BRE? Was it at the same time as the as the sheathing board?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Do you know who signed for it at the BRE?
I would imagine Phil Clark,
Right. You say you would imagine. Why would you imagine that?
because he took delivery of the majority of the materials that were used on those rigs.
Do you recall having a conversation with Phil Clark about the use of 6mm magnesium oxide in those two locations on the rig?
Yes.
Do you remember when those conversations were?
Initially, when we were talking to the BRE about retesting,
Yes?
following the meeting with Jamie, Paul and Rob, I think I put a phone call into Phil to suggest that we were looking to retest. We'd taken on board, obviously, what we'd just learned from the first test, and we were going to look to increase the cladding panel to 12mm and use magnesium oxide at fire barrier level 2.
What about the top of the rig?
I don't know whether I mentioned to him about the top of the rig or not, but
Looking back on it, are you in any doubt that, at least as at the date of the test, Phil Clark was well aware that the rig included a 6mm magnesium oxide panel at the level 2 thermocouples and at the top of the rig?
yes.
You say yes. Are you in any doubt?
Oh, sorry, no.
You're not in any doubt at
No,
all.
no.
Do you know whether, to the best of your recollection, anybody else at the BRE was aware that 6mm magnesium oxide panels were used sitting behind the Eternit at level 2 thermocouples and at the top of the rig?
I don't know.
Right. Now, the rig was assembled by Patrick, or Patch, Jones of Simcoe, I think, wasn't it?
Yes.
Did you provide him with any updated drawings which showed the magnesium oxide board?
No.
Why is that?
Because following the first test, so Simcoe created an initial set of drawings for test 1. From memory, I think they were based on the dimensions of one test rig. There's 4 at the BRE, and we were subsequently moved on to a different test rig. So those initial drawings came out of date very quickly. There was a couple of comments from Simcoe that they'd spent a bit too much time on the design of the rig, and I started to get the feeling that they didn't want to help us out anymore, really. So that's predominantly the reason why the drawings weren't updated.
Right. In paragraph 5.35 of your statement, you say that Celotex didn't want to pay for updated drawings. Is that really the reason why Simcoe didn't produce any updated drawings?
Yeah, I think, as I said previously, that there was a view that they were starting to become frustrated with the level of involvement that the first test required, and they almost indicated that, yes, they would need to charge us again for a second set of drawings, which Celotex didn't really want to pay for.
Right. It wouldn't have been very expensive, though, would it?
I don't know what the test fees were or the design fees.
Well, let's just look at one document, CEL 50980, please. We can see here that this is an invoice from Simcoe dated the 30th of June 2014 for if you look at the left-hand side under description, there are 2 asterisks, fire test catch-up rig 2, redrawing rig, and they charge £420 plus VAT, in total £504. So looks from that whatever drawings they did do did not cost a great deal of money in the big scheme of things, did they?
No.
Was the real reason that no design drawings were revised and produced by Simcoe was to conceal the use of magnesium oxide? 6mm magnesium oxide.
I don't think it was, no.
Did anybody from the BRE check the final drawings that Simcoe had produced against the rig actually constructed?
I don't believe they did, no.
Did Simcoe, regardless of the drawings, know that what went onto the rig included a 6mm magnesium oxide panel at level 2 thermocouples and at the top of the rig?
The installers did, yes.
The installers did.
Yeah.
Does the same go for the use of the 8mm Malia Ternit Natura cladding panels at those locations?
Yes.
Do you know whether the installers pass that information back to Simco?
I don't know.
Who are the installers?
Patch, as you previously referred.
Yes.
And I don't know who the other individual was.
Right. Given that there weren't any up-to-date drawings from Simco, did somebody have to tell Patch Jones what changes to make and what to put up?
Yes,
Who was that?
that was me.
Right. Anybody else?
No,
Was Phil Clark involved in those discussions about how to construct the rig?
no, I believe he wasn't. No.
Right. And paragraph 5.35 of your statement, if we can just look at those, look at that paragraph, you say, we thought that Patrick, this is the fourth line, we thought that Patrick could oversee the construction without the need for revised drawings. And then if you go over the page, Patrick was instructed by me. I passed instructions on from Paul to Rob to build the same system as for the first test with 2 changes, thickening the cladding panel to 12mm and inserting the magnesium oxide board on the fire panel at level 2 and at the top of the rig. Did you also tell him to install the 8mm cladding panels at those locations?
Yes,
And again, were you doing so, were you passing instructions from Paul and Rob?
correct.
And how did you give him those instructions? Did you just stand at the bottom of the rig and tell him what to do?
Yeah. I mean, I don't confess to be an expert in fixing cladding systems to a rig, but Patch had obviously installed cladding systems on a number of occasions, and I just instructed that at level 2 it needed to change to a 6 and an 8 combination, and then equally at the top of the rig.
Right. Did you explain to him why those components, the 6mm magnesium oxide and the 8mm Malia Ternit Natura cladding panels, were going on in those locations?
Yes.
Are you in any doubt in your mind about whether he understood what the purpose of that was?
No.
Did he say anything to you?
No, I think he understood. He was curious as to how the first test went, and that was demonstrated. That was one of the reasons why the rig was altered.
Right. Paragraph 5.37, same page, you say, once the test started, it was quickly apparent that the 12mm cladding panel made a significant difference to the performance of the system in the test compared with the one used in the February test. I thought that this was due to the thickening of the cladding panels. I thought that the thinner panels cracking had been a reason for the failure of the first test, and the thicker panels were more robust. How could you know or think that it was the thicker cladding panel that improved the performance rather than the additional material which had been incorporated?
Because the nature of the test is you have a rig at the, you have a crib at the bottom of the rig, and the flames reenact breaking out of a window, I believe, and attacking the face of the cladding panel. And the cladding panel at that location was the 12mm Malia Ternit.
I see. So that was at the bottom?
Yes.
Just above the crib?
Correct.
Did you have any discussions with anybody from the BRE during the test?
Not to my recollection, no.
Right. Was anybody from the BRE, apart from Phil Clark, was Phil Clark present during the test?
Yes.
Was anybody else from the BRE present during the test?
I think there were a couple of individuals from the BRE, but I don't know who they were.
Right. Stephen Howard?
I don't know.
Tony Baker?
Again, I don't know.
Right, you don't know. We then move in time after the test to May 2014. Can we go to CEL 403116, please? so later in May. This is a meeting invitation which you sent to Paul Evans and he accepted. And the subject was an above 18-metre discussion in the CC office for the 12th of May 2014. See that? CC office, does that stand for Craig Chambers' office?
Correct, yes.
Was well, did that meeting take place?
I don't know. I presume so from...
Do you recall meeting in Craig Chambers' office on the 12th of May 2014?
I don't know.
No. Now, the subject of the meeting, according to the invitation, was above 12 metres. This was just before a meeting of the Management Action Group, wasn't it, I think?
Yes.
And that was to take place, and indeed did take place, on the 13th and 14th of May 2014, yes?
Correct.
Doing the best you can with your recollection on this document, was the purpose of the meeting to brief Craig Chambers about the May test in advance of the meeting, in advance of the MAG meeting?
That was more than likely, yes.
Right. But you have no recollection of what you discussed with Craig Chambers or indeed with Paul Evans at that meeting?
I don't know.
Do you remember being asked by Paul Evans to prepare some slides for the forthcoming MAG meeting?
I do, yes.
Do you remember when it was?
No, I don't.
Right. Did you yourself attend the MAG meeting on the 13th and or 14th of May?
I don't believe I did, no.
Yeah. Let's look at the slides you prepared. CEL 50933. And these can also be found, because I think they've been referred to elsewhere, at CEL 408648 for the transcript. And these are entitled Above 18 Metres. And note, if you would, perhaps you can't, but take it from me that this document runs to 17 pages. And again, if you look at page 2, the first substantive page, we can see background, approved document B, section 12, insulation materials, section 12.7. Do you remember putting this slideshow together?
Yes.
And starting with that background, yes?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, if we go to page 11, this is slide 11, market research, and we can see some bullet points here. Let's just look at them. Everybody uses K15 as there is no alternative. Nobody understands the test requirements. Architects ask if it can be used above 18 metres. The answer is, and this is capitalised, yes. Building control have hugely differing levels of understanding on the subject. Give us a board that is an alternative to Kingspan and we'll buy it. So those 4 bullet points there, were they your personal view as a result of your survey of the market that you'd done previously?
No, not just my view, I don't think. I think Paul had some input on this presentation.
Right.
And I think a lot of those points had been probably previously discussed in some of the initial meetings.
Right. Was the basic point from this slide that you wanted to get across to the MAG, the board meeting, essentially, was that the market was ignorant, their ignorance had been exploited by Kingspan, and you wanted to do the same?
Not me personally.
No, but you, Celotex?
Yes.
Yes. And that's because it was worth £10 million worth of revenues to Kingspan?
I believe so, yes.
And we can see that from the previous slide. Let's just have that up, page 10. Last bullet point. This is about Kingspan K15. You can see there, worth circa £10 million per annum in the last bullet point. Now let's look at slide 12. This describes the build-up of the first test. Testing part 1. That's a reference to the February failed test, isn't it?
Correct.
Cost £25,000. System 8mm Eternit cladding, Lamitherm fire barriers, 100mm FR 5000, sheathing board, Metsec frame. Result terminated after 25 minutes. Flames extending test facility. And then if we look at slide 14, page 14, that then describes the build-up of the second test. Testing part 2, cost £25,000, system 12 millimetres Eternic cladding, Lamitherm fire barriers with 6 millimetre magnesium oxide, 100 millimetres FR5000 sheathing board Metsec frame. Now, we can see that there are two differences between testing part 1 and testing part 2, can't we? The first is the increase from 8 to 12 millimetres of Eternic cladding, yes?
Yes.
And the second is the reference there in the second dashed bullet to 6 millimetres of magnesium oxide, yes?
Yes.
There's no mention there of the thinner layer of Marley Eternic cladding, i.e. the 8 millimetres at the thermocouples at level 2 or at the top of the rig. Why is that?
Because I guess I probably relied on Paul to expand it on that system, really.
Right. Now, do you remember emailing these slides to Paul Evans on the 14th of May during the meetings?
Yes.
Can we look at CEL 50932? This is an email you sent him with the presentation, and it says no more than that. Does that tell us that you didn't discuss these slides with Paul Evans at the meeting on the 12th of May that's referred to in your Outlook diary, or at all before you sent them to him?
I'd have definitely discussed those slides with him.
Right.
Prior to me sending them. I mean, it looks like it's 45 minutes before his time slot of 11:30. So it would be very unlikely for me to send a presentation 45 minutes before and say, present that.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And that has anticipated, I think, one or two of my questions later. But so the short point is you had discussed this 17-page slide deck with him.
Correct.
Now, you refer in your statement at paragraph 6.3, if we can just have that, please, in your statement at page 14. You say, I emailed Paul the slide deck on the 14th of May 2014. This email was timed at 10:46 a.m., which implies I may have sent it to Paul whilst the board meeting was ongoing, but I cannot be sure. And then you go on to say, following the board meeting, Paul asked me to create another version of the board presentation which did not refer to the February test or to the 6 millimetre magnesium oxide. He said that this was for general business use. And I'll just go on and finish it off. I believe that this shorter version of the slides would be used for the sales team. I prepared an edited version as per Paul's instructions. Just going back, you say you sent these slides to him during the meeting. As far as you know, were these slides presented to the meeting?
I believe so, yes.
All 17 pages in that set, were they?
I don't know. It would be very unlikely to skip slides of a presentation.
Right. Can we then take it that it's your evidence, as far as you recall it, that everybody at that MAG meeting was aware of the differences between the build-up of the failed February 2014 test and the build-up of the successful May 2014 test?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know who presented those slides to the meeting?
I presume Paul. I think he had a flat roofing review and an above 18 metre review to present. Now,
as we've just seen in your statement at the bottom of page 14 and over to the top of page 15, paragraph 6.3, that after that meeting, Paul Evans asked you to produce a shorter version of the slides which didn't refer to the February test or the magnesium oxide. Do you remember whether he asked you to do that in a conversation or a meeting, or whether he did that by email?
No, conversation, I believe.
Conversation. And how soon after the meeting do you remember he asked you to do that?
I believe it was on that same day, because I think I had a spin meeting, which was another internal meeting that afternoon. So
you say at the top of page 15, you say he said that this was for general business use. Did he use those words?
He did, yes, and then he subsequently expanded on those as well.
What did he say by way of expansion?
He suggested that following that meeting, the decision had been taken to launch the product. I was to continue to progress with NHBC, LABC and approval, and BRE testing, and that the decision had been made to omit the magnesium oxide from any reference going forward.
Now you say, I believe that this shorter version of the slides would be used for the sales team. Did he say that? Or is it something you inferred?
It was something that he indicated, that when it came to launch and sales team and even the technical centre, that this shorter version of the slides would be used.
In the answer before last, you said that the decision had been made to omit the magnesium oxide from any reference going forward. When you say the decision had been made, did you understand him to mean that the MAG had made that decision?
I don't know whether it was the MAG. I can only presume, because the decision, as it was relayed to me, was after that meeting.
Yes.
So.
Really what I'm trying to get at is whether your impression of this was that the decision to use a shorter slideshow without the 6mm magnesium oxide was an MAG decision which had been communicated to him, which he was then communicating to you, or whether it was just simply his decision as a result of what he picked up at the MAG meeting.
I think it was the first of those.
Right, thank you. And I think you did produce a shorter version, and we're going to come to those in a moment. Before I go to those, can I just look at paragraph 6.4 while we're on that page? You say there, Louise Garlick, the customer service manager, who I believe had apparently been present for at least some of the board meeting, spoke to me at around this time and told me that there had been a heated exchange between Rob Warren and Paul as to what to do. The upshot, as I understood it from Miss Garlick, was that a decision had been taken. It was not entirely clear to me when or by whom, that there would be no reference to the first failed test, nor to the magnesium oxide board used in the second test. And then you say, with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed to me that Celotex was going down the Kingspan route in not giving full details of the system that had been tested. Did anybody else tell you about this heated exchange other than Miss Garlick?
No, I don't believe so.
What did you understand the heated exchange to have been?
Well, at the time, it was most likely the divisive issue that had been brought up on many occasions in terms of system versus product, commercial versus technical.
And did you understand who was on which side?
Yes.
And Rob Warren was on what side?
Technical, system.
And Paul Evans?
Commercial.
Those are useful shorthands, but do we take it from that Rob Warren had wanted to be clear and transparent, but Paul Evans not?
I think it came back to the initial conversation that had been had in the business on numerous occasions around, are we going to market and launch this product as a system, or are we going to market and launch this product into a market that's already established as just another alternative option?
Established on the back of Kingspan's dominance and what it had told the market.
Correct.
And what those certifying its products were prepared to say.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, let's go to the slideshow. Before I do, let me just ask you one more question. Given that Paul Evans had asked you to remove references to the magnesium oxide in the slides, did you understand that he had supported that decision during the heated exchange or at the MAG meeting more generally?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's look at the slide. CEL 50961. Now, you remember that the one you produced for the meeting was 17 pages. This now comes down to 12 pages. Is this your revised slide pack
I believe it is, yes.
in response to Mr. Evans's instructions? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, we can thumb through it, but it's right, isn't it, that this doesn't mention the February test at all?
No.
No. And that was presumably to conceal the fact that Celotex had failed the February test.
Correct.
Yeah. And if we look at slide 9, page 9, we can now see the description of the test build-up, which of course is the second test, as we know. Cost 25,000, system 12 millimetres, Eternit cladding, Lamitherm fire barriers, and note no reference there to the 6 millimetre magnesium oxide. And then it goes on as per 100 millimetres FR5000, sheathing board, Metsec frame, result passed, completed 60 minutes testing. Now, I've just shown you this. There's no mention of the magnesium oxide, and indeed there's no mention of the 8 millimetres Eternit cladding either, in the same way as, in fact, hadn't been mentioned in the 17-page version. And again, were both of those omissions designed to mislead the reader into thinking that the build-up here we can see on page 9 was the actual build-up tested?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Now, you say in paragraph 6.5 of your statement, if we can just go back to the page we were on in your statement, that with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed to me that Celotex was going down the Kingspan route and not giving full details of the system that had been tested. In fact, you knew at the time, surely, that this slide was downright misleading.
Yes, yeah, I did.
You did, and intended to mislead.
Yes.
And did you realise at the time that if this was how the test was to be described to the market, it would be a fraud on the market?
Yes, yeah, I did.
Did you not feel at the time a sense that that was wrong?
I felt incredibly uncomfortable with it. I recall going home that evening. I still lived with my parents at the time, and mentioned that to them, and I felt incredibly uncomfortable with what I was being asked to do.
Was there nobody in Celotex you could have gone to and shared those concerns with?
All of the senior management were in that meeting.
So is the answer to my question no?
Yeah, no.
Now, following the May fire test, it's right, isn't it, that the BRE provided you with a series of reports, or a number of reports? Yes?
Correct, yes.
Yes. And there are, in fact, I think 3 different reports. We have a full, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, there's a full test report dated the 1st of August 2014, which bears the number 295369, and that ran to some 33 pages.
That's right, yes.
And then there's a classification report, 295255, which ran to 12 pages. There was also, I think, a summary classification report, which had 4 pages, also under report reference 295255. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Right. Now, let's see if we can trace the chronology through. Mr. Roper, are you all right to carry on, or should we have a break?
No, that's fine.
Yeah?
Fine.
Okay. We'll finish at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, okay.
All right. The first is CEL 403177. And this is an email of the 19th of June 2014 from Phil Clark to you. And it's timed at 10:30. Now, that becomes important later, because at that time I think you were about to go into a meeting with the NHBC, weren't you?
Yes, I was, yeah.
Dave White and Graham Smith, I think it is.
Graham Perry, yes.
Graham Perrior, right.
Yes.
And he says, John, please find attached a draft report for comment only. This is not the only version, and as such is liable to change, and has not been through the BRE quality system. If you have any changes you wish to include, please let me know, and I will endeavour to include them in the final version. Now, am I right in thinking that was the full test report, although in draft?
I believe so, yes.
Yes. Do you know why it took them so long to issue you a draft?
No, I think that was standard practice at the BRE. I think they were traditionally very slow at issuing test
Right.
reports.
Can we look at the report? It's CEL 403178. And that's the first page there on the screen. And it's called Issue 1 and bears a date of the 2nd of June 2014. And if we go to yes, we can come to that. That's the first version. And I think what then happens, and I'll come back into that document in a moment, just chronologically, you then reply to that on the 1st of July, CEL 401350. We just have that. That's an email from you to Phil Clark, copied to Paul Evans and Jamie Hayes. And in the second paragraph there, you say, I've asked him to send these through to you in my absence.
Sorry, we haven't got it yet, Mr. Millett. Thank you.
The first paragraph refers to the updated drawings. In the second paragraph, you say, I've asked him to send these through to you in my absence. Can you please run these by Jamie to check all the details and send through to Phil at BRE the relevant drawings, etc. And then you say Phil is due to go off on leave. Now, I'll come back to that email later on, but in chronological terms, that's when you made comments, I think. And if we look at the second email down, over onto the second page, this is an email from you of the 1st of July to Phil Clark. And you say at the top of page 2, as discussed, please find attached our first draft comments for our BR135 test report. Annotations are highlighted throughout the document. And you say we will send these through, send through the revised drawings to replace figures 4, 5 and 6 once we receive updated details from Simco this week. And then you say, as previously discussed, could you also replace figure 18 with the attached photographs, as we want to show a close-up of the condition of our insulation below and above fire break with the intumescent fired off. If you feel you also have a suitable photograph, then please include. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute, but just in chronological terms, that was when you sent that. And then, if you go to CEL 403234, this is, if you go to the second email down on that page, you can see that there's an email from Phil Clark to you, 30th of July 2014 at 11:11. John, please find attached PDF unapproved of the test report as requested. Regards, Phil Clark. And the subject line says, emailing Celotex draft version 4 for signing. You see that? Now, version 4 came then, but it looks like version 1 amended from you came to him on the 1st of July. Were there any changes to the test report during July, do you remember, which led to version 4?
Were there any changes to
the test report?
Between him initially issuing the draft back in the 1st of July and yes, there were some updated drawings, and then there was this request for a photograph to be removed.
Right. Well, we'll come back to the photographs. But it's right that the main changes between version 1, which you then commented on, and version 4 that he sends back to you at the end of July were changes to drawings and photographs.
Drawings and photographs, yeah.
Yes. And then if we go to BRE 405514, this is the report, issue 1, dated the 4th of August 2014, of the classification report. And if you go to CEL 402008, This is an email of the 11th of August. CEL 2008. If you look at the second email down, Debbie Kent sends you an email on the 11th of August. Dear John, apologies for the format error. Please find attached reissued report with amendments. And that was the classification report. And is it right that it had to be reissued because in places it contained an error message?
That's
that
right.
was all.
Yes. Yeah.
And then I think issue 2 was then sent out with that fixed on the same day, and that was the only change.
Correct.
Right. It's right, I think, that the BRE never sent you a 4-page report, isn't it?
That's right.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a convenient moment. We're going to look next at the full test report in a little bit more detail.
Yes, well, it probably is a good point then, isn't
Yes.
it? We'll have a break now, Mr. Roper, so we can all get some lunch. I'm going to ask you to be back at 2 o'clock, please, and not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it over the adjournment, all right?
Fine.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to the usher, please. Thank you. 2 o'clock, then, please. Thank you.